Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, June 16th, 2023. The Supreme Court exposes more IRS abusive powers. If you're going to have a federal income tax, there are three things that inevitably come along with it. First, there are going to be people who try to cheat the system in order to pay less than they actually owe. Consequently, an income tax requires a large, powerful federal agency with broad investigative and enforcement powers in order to identify the cheaters and compel them to comply with the law. Second, those powers must be precisely defined and delegated to the enforcement agency by Congress. And third, there will inevitably be cases where the courts are going to have to decide if the agency is properly exercising those powers or if certain enforcement practices are outside the law. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Abusive v. Internal Revenue Service confirmed that the IRS has a broad power to obtain information from third parties to aid in the collection of a tax debt without giving notice to the third parties, even if there's no evidence that the third-party accounts have any legal connection to the party who owes money to the IRS. The article on natlawreview.com explains the effect of this ruling. The court was tasked with determining whether the IRS, pursuant to powers granted in Internal Revenue Code Section 7609 C2DI, is entitled to issue third-party summonses without notice for bank records concerning accounts in which the taxpayer being investigated does not have a legal interest. In Abusive, the IRS entered an official assessment against Remo Abusive for more than $2 million in unpaid taxes and penalties. The IRS then issued summonses on 3 banks seeking the financial records of several third parties, including Abusive's wife and 2 law firms that represented him. These third parties were given notice by the bank, who received the summonses, and one of the third parties moved to quash the summons. In the litigation that ensued, the third parties argued that the no-notice exception in Section 7609 C2DI applied only if the taxpayer being targeted has some legal interest in the accounts or the records being sought by the summonses. The Supreme Court's decision is based on the finding that Section 7609 C2DI sets forth only 3 specific conditions to exempt the IRS from providing notice. The court found it notable that the statute does not mention a legal interest or require that a taxpayer maintain an interest in an account for the exception to apply. In conclusion, since the IRS would not have this power if Congress did not grant it to them, it brings to mind this statement by Mahatma Gandhi. If there's an idiot in power, it's because those who elected him are well represented. Yes, we the people elected Congress, and the responsibility is ours. So what does this mean for ordinary people like us? If someone you know well or work with owes the IRS money, the IRS can issue a summons on your bank to provide information about your accounts with no assertion that you have any legal relationship to the person the IRS is attacking. Worse, they can do this without you even knowing that your records were turned over to the IRS. Of course, everyone knows the IRS would never abuse this power. Right. Now, even though the court ruled in favor of doing searches on third-party accounts having no connection to the taxpayer, the court left an opening for an appeal. It did not determine what the key words "in aid of the collection" mean, and this issue is going to be a basis for other appeals. Was looking at the bank account of someone who has no connection to the party owing money really an aid in collection? Like debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, it's a huge waste of time. Why do we waste money and time arguing over things like the definition of aid? The only people who win, and they really do win, are the lawyers representing the parties who will sue the IRS and the bureaucrats in D.C. In fact, why do we waste time and money on completing the IRS forms and tax returns each year? Congress in D.C. knows that there's a better alternative, the FAIRtax. Instead of spending time and money doing endless hours of paperwork that don't create anything of value to yourself, your family, or the nation, Why not eliminate the unnecessary waste? Now, many in D.C. oppose the fair tax because it would transfer power from the government to the people while at the same time giving the people a better chance of succeeding on their own. Isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? When the fair tax is enacted, there will be no need to fear being audited by the IRS because there will be no more IRS. Under the fair tax, there will be no more tax returns. We'll pay our taxes when we make retail purchases of new goods and services. Now, there's going to be a vote on the fair tax in the House of Representatives. Speaker McCarthy and the other elites didn't want it, but it was forced on them. So, we now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to show where they stand. They can vote for the present income payroll tax system, or they can vote for the fair tax. They can support the corrupt income tax in the IRS, or they can vote to eliminate it. It can't be any simpler than that. They can hide the true cost of their government, or they can pass the fair tax and show everyone the true cost of government on every retail receipt. And finally, they can support the largest transfer of power from the government to the people, the fair tax, or they can vote against it. If members think the fair tax needs to be changed, then they can propose that change. Don't let them get away with rejecting the entire bill because it has a small flaw that can be easily addressed. Please stand with us and demand that your representatives support a much fairer, much simpler, and much more efficient way to fund the government, the fair tax. The fair tax doesn't pick winners and losers. Because it taxes spending, not earnings, the fair tax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. The fair tax collects the revenue the federal government needs to operate, but does so in a way that has the least adverse impact on our individual freedom and the least impact on our economic prosperity. With a fair tax, there are no tax returns to file and no records to keep. We pay our federal taxes when we make retail purchases of new goods and services, and with a fair tax, there is no need for the IRS. If you sell a used couch or a used jet ski online, there's no fair tax due on that transaction. The fair tax will allow us to take back control. The income payroll tax system is broken. It's no longer working. We can't repair it, but we can replace it with the fair tax. Join us and take back control of our country and our lives, not with bullets, but with the elimination of one of the biggest threats to our liberty and economic prosperity, the income payroll tax. We should all remember Edmund Burke's warning that applies to our efforts to take back control. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. We should also remember this quote from George Orwell's 1984, which, if we do nothing, may well foretell your and your children's future. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So what can each of us do? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives and attend Zoom town hall meetings demanding that if they really want to allow Americans to take back control, the first step is to eliminate the income payroll tax system and enact the fair tax. Take back control. Help us pass the fair tax. Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing, or we could call that investing, $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. Now, of course, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but it'll be used for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to FAIRtax.org and invest in AFFT. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.